Hello, everybody. Welcome to the boot camp. I think we're going to wait a few minutes until everyone arrives. I'm John. I'll be running the webinar today. I'd love to maybe while we're waiting, just hear where everybody's from. So I think there's a Q&A submission box through Zoom. So if you wouldn't mind just typing where you're dialing in from, that'd be fun to see. I'm dialing in from Cambridge. UK. Okay, great. New Hampshire. Okay, it looks like we've got a chat box and a Q&A box. So I guess go for either one. Columbia as well. Cool. New Jersey. I like it. In Argentina, wow. Okay, very international crowd today. Fantastic. We have an exclamation point behind Columbus, Ohio. All right, there's Chile. Fantastic. All right, we'll give everybody a minute more to join, and then we'll get started. Another explanation point here for Connie, New Jersey. All right, 2 New Jerseys. Okay, why don't we get started? Maybe some more people that join along the way. Looks like we've got about 40 some attendees now, so that's great. Quite a good group. Okay, well, welcome today. We've got an hour. My name's John Howard. I'm an entrepreneur. I'll give a little background in a second, but today's talk is focused on how to select your customer segment. And to do that, I'm mostly going to focus on 2 case studies from my 2 startups. We'll kind of go through those, and then we'll have a little time at the end for more Q&A. I'd love to ask you for some of your takeaways from my stories and some of your own experiences at the end as well. So it might be interesting to take some notes as we go through it, things that you've observed, interesting comments or questions that you have, and we'll come back to those towards the end. If you have any questions throughout, you can feel free to put them on the Q&A. I may be able to answer some of them as we go through. So feel free to give it a try. I might not have time to, and we'll try to come to some towards the end of the presentation. Oh yeah, there we go. Please use Q&A box for questions. Okay, so let's do that. We'll keep them in the Q&A box. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm John Howard. I'll give you a little background on myself just so you know where I'm coming from. I'm an engineer by training. Got my start in robotics. I used to build battle bots as fighting robots you may have seen on some TV shows back when I was in high school. Studied mechanical engineering and business economics in university at Caltech. Got very interested in business and startups. Spent a couple of years after my undergrad working at McKinsey as an analyst, and then I started and run 2 companies that we'll talk about today. Duron, which is a consumer electronics company focused on solar energy products in India, and then Jhana, which is a B2B SaaS company that developed a product to help support new managers. Since then, for the last 2 years, I've been here at MIT going through a mid-career master's program on product architecture called System Design and Management. And I've been working a lot with MIT's Open Learning, where I'm sitting now today, which helps run the boot camps to help them launch some new initiatives. It's kind of an intrapreneurship project. So some experience. I should also mention I advise and consult for quite a few different startups. So I've been working beyond the 2 that I've started and run myself. I've also been a part of another 4 or 5 in a pretty significant way. So hopefully I'll be able to share some stories, share some insights that will help you decide what customer segments you want to focus on for your startups, whether you're currently looking for that customer segment or you're thinking about starting a company. Of course, this is one of the important things to do in the early days, or you're just curious. So with that, why don't I shift over into story mode a little bit. I've got a few slides to take you through. There's more slides from the first startup, Duron, because it's a physical product. There's more things to show pictures of. The second one is a digital product. It's less slide driven, but still an interesting story, I think. I'm going to try to hold each story to about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, we'll see, so that we've got some time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to try to do screen share here. Okay, hopefully that's working. Great. So here we go. So how to select your customer segments, 2 case studies. I think maybe before I jump into the first one on Duron, I might also point out that both of these had pretty different approaches to finding a customer segment, which is why I think they're kind of interesting, contrasting stories. Duron, as you'll see, we started with a very broad approach, and we kind of narrowed down over time. Whereas Jhana, with the second startup, we focused on a very narrow segment initially, but then we shifted segments a few times to eventually get to our final one. Both took about 6 to 9, even 12 months to really lock down on our main customer segment. It took quite a lot of time. But we'll go through that story of how it worked for both of these. So I'll start with Duron. This company I co-founded in 2008, working within an incubator in Los Angeles called Idea Lab. And from day one, all of us, the co-founders, had an initial desire to find a way to help provide better energy access in developing countries. We're all very aligned around that one objective. However, we didn't know how we were going to do it. And we didn't know which customer segment at all that we were going to focus on. In fact, none of us really had that much experience in the markets that we wanted to serve. I had backpacked a bit through India a few years before. None of the other co-founders really had spent much time in those countries. So we had quite a few interesting product ideas. I'll share a few of those in a minute, but very little market understanding from day one. We were very fortunate to have some funding that allowed us to do the market research that we needed to do to eventually decide what direction we wanted to take the company. So first, I'll just give you a little high-level view of our approach. This is conceptual. We'll talk about the details, the practical details in some upcoming slides. We really viewed our approach in 2 different paths, 2 different but parallel paths. Some of you might recognize this from Steve Blank's customer discovery and also product discovery. We've got a quick question on how we got funding when we had no MVP. A track record from one of the other co-founders helped us get the funding. And then we also just had a very excited investor who shared our mission. And he was quite a wealthy individual, a billionaire hedge fund manager. So for him, a large investment to us was a small investment to him. So we were very fortunate in the early days. So we had these 2 different paths, and we really tried to run both of these in parallel. We'll spend a little bit more time on the market path today. And what we try to do is really prioritize, because we had no idea where we wanted to focus. We said, what are some likely candidates? Then let's really understand them well, try to figure out their needs, and in parallel, start developing some of the partnerships we knew we would need to bring a product to market. And at some point, kind of in the middle of this graph, pick which segment we wanted to focus on, and then move forward, really test out that hypothesis when we brought the product to market to sell, see if people actually bought it, if we had a business model that was working, and move forward from there. On the bottom path, we were doing in parallel similar steps. We were also scanning kind of broadly what are possible technologies that might work and possible products that might work for us. Then do a lot of field investigation to see if those seem to fit with the needs on the ground. Develop some prototypes, do some field testing, eventually pick a product, and then do all the work to set up manufacturing and bring it to market. Have a question around approximate timelines. The initial hope was that we could get through all of this from left to right in about 9 months. However, in practice, it took us about 1.5 years, I think, before we launched our first kind of very solidly commercially ready product. We were launching some prototypes before that. And I think we'll get in a little detail on the timeline for each stage in some of the subsequent slides here. So that was the high-level plan. I want to just touch briefly, just to show you the range of different technologies and products we were looking at in this next slide. Not to go through the details here, but just kind of looking at the left. We were, I had previously been working on a low-cost plastic injection molded wind turbine as one idea. Another one of the co-founders was working on actually very large-scale solar thermal systems, up in the hundreds of megawatts range, so huge systems, and thinking about how we might be able to bring that down to a community level. We had heard a lot about microbial fuel cells, and we were looking at solar cooling, and of course, a lot of more personal individual products beyond this list. So a huge range of possibilities and lots of different customer segments to consider. One of the first things we did was prioritize down to a few locations for field research. So we, through a lot of conversations with experts and our own kind of desk research, we shortlisted 4 countries, and we kind of broke India into 2 parts, although India is much more complicated than even 2 parts. And we went to each one for about a week, week and a half each, to do a lot of initial exploratory field research. Some of that time was meeting with experts, but most of it was just renting a car and driving out into the rural areas and just getting a feel for what's going on the ground. So we really didn't have a good idea itself. Fantastic trip. Took about 6 weeks to get through it all. We learned a ton. And I think I have a few pictures from that trip. Yeah, here are some. These are from India, for instance. And we were really just exploring the basics. What kind of how are people using energy today? Where are they getting it from? What kind of unmet needs do they have, et cetera? We were very carefully observing what products they used. And we'd ask them what was working and what wasn't working about each product. What have they considered, but they haven't bought? Just a lot of general background information. And we also sort of zoomed in on some individuals that we would profile to understand just their context in life. It's a lot of the typical customer empathy work that you'd use in design thinking. What are their occupations? What do they do? What's an average day look like? What's their income? Where do they get it from? And of course, we'd focus a lot on their energy situation, whether they had grid electricity or not, how much, if they don't, how are they lighting their home? How are they powering their devices, et cetera. There's a question on slides afterwards, and yes, I think we'll be able to share those. We also did some market sizing, just to get a rough sense of how big the market is. This is one state in India. It's the largest state in India by population, Uttar Pradesh in North India. And we were just curious how those people broke down along some dimensions that we thought might be important for customer segmentation. One of the things we discovered is that there's a huge difference between people that have grid electricity and people that don't have grid electricity in terms of their energy cost. So one of our important segmentation dimensions was how much and how were they electricity as well. So we had 4 categories here. One where they were on the grid and they had a lot of grid electricity. Another one where they were on the grid but only had some electricity. It might only be an hour or 2 a day. 3 is if they're not on the grid, but they're near the grid. So they could easily go to maybe charge a battery with at someone's house who has grid electricity. And then 4th is if they're very far away from the grid. And then the other main segmentation dimension that we came up with was income level, which of course has a big impact on what kind of products someone could buy. We just did 3 simple categories for this: low income, lower middle income, and middle plus income. And the place that we thought would be most attractive to start, based on a lot of work we were doing and looking at different product types as well, was the boxes that have been highlighted here. It's kind of the relatively well-off folks in the rural areas who still had major energy problems. And it seemed like in Uttar Pradesh, at least, there were still enough of those. You can see it's a small percentage of the overall population, but still 1 million homes. It's plenty. We thought that would be plenty to get started. And this is just one state in India. So that's how we sort of narrowed down a little bit here initially. Next we went, I have a question here on any support from organizations, governments, or group interested in developing these products. Yes, we were working with quite a few partners that would help guide us in some of our market research. These were even distributors, certainly some government reports, some other product companies that weren't competing with us, but curious about what was going on. We worked closely with quite a few different partners. So after we did all that initial research, we kind of zeroed down and said, okay, we think probably sort of these well-off individual households who are kind of far from the grid would be a good segment. we discounted community scale systems because we saw a lot of problems with existing community scale products around problems of the commons where no one would really take care of it, or they'd have utilization challenges. So we thought, let's just try to make something that an individual household could buy for themselves. And then we also shortlisted down our different product concepts to 3. And these are, this is really going back to the early days here. You can see some of our very early product sketches of these 3 different ideas. The simple ideas. One is a hand crank battery charge, hand crank flashlight that could also charge a phone. We have a pedal power device, and we have something we call a sunbox, which is in the technical terms, it's a solar home system. But basically it's a solar panel and a storage unit with some lights. So these are the 3 concepts that we had coming out of that early work. We then built prototypes for each one and took them back to the field. We had chose India as our country, and we took them back to the field to do some quick field testing with our prototypes. We literally had 1 of each version, so the very little field testing we could do, but at least we could get some early feedback from our customer segment to see if it would fit. And we very quickly shortlisted down to the winner here, the Sunbox concept. The problem with the pedal generator is no one really wanted to pedal it. Sounds good in practice, but no one wants to pedal. And then the crank generator, it turns out there are already some versions of this on the market that we kind of missed that were going to be cheaper than anything we could really develop and compete with well. So the Sunbox got really good reception. So we said, okay, that's our concept, and we feel like we're getting close on the customer segment. Let's go to the next stage, build some more sophisticated prototypes and do a more comprehensive field test. So that's what we did. This is the next version. This was a pretty substantial effort. We made about 20 versions of the next version of the product prototype, which you can see here. We did 2 separate field tests in parallel, one in northern India and Uttar Pradesh and one in southern India and Karnataka. I led the Karnataka one. And it was a month long with about 10 different I'd say 15 different households in each place, where we would actually install the product, see how they used it, get a lot of feedback along the way. And we learned a ton from that. Coming out of that, we had a pretty good idea of the changes that we needed to make in the product. And we also felt increasingly confident about our customer segment. A few more pictures from the field trial. We got a lot of encouraging feedback, as I mentioned, from customers, or hopefully future customers, I should say. They're saying, yes, I'll buy it as soon as it comes to market. And they're even throwing out some price figures, which was great. And then critically, we also try to get a lot of feedback from our distributors, who we almost viewed as another type of customer. We really, if we just had a product that the distributors wanted to buy, but our end users didn't, that wouldn't work. And if we just had something the end users wanted to buy, but our distributors didn't want to sell it, or didn't fit within the distribution channels, that wouldn't work either. So we really needed both together. So these are some possible distributors we were talking to at the time, and we got a lot of good feedback from them. So we felt increasingly good about it. And so we went to the next step, which was a concept refinement. And then we started to ramp up for manufacturing, which was quite a lot of work. It took some time, maybe 3 to 6 months. And got a question on one-time sale. Yes, it is a one-time sale. There's some battery replacement costs down the road, but pretty much a one-time sale product. And it costs about $120 US when we brought it to market. We'd work with financing organizations to fund it. So we brought it to market, and this was really where, I don't know, the moment of truth, let's say, where I found this for both my startups, where you finally built this thing and you're going to find out if people will actually pay for it. You've done a lot of work to hope that they'll pay for it. You think they're going to buy it, but will they actually buy it? Will it work through the distribution channels? And in this case, it did work. People really liked it. Distribution was challenging, but we got that to work too. Here's some examples of the products in people's homes. And we pretty much stuck with this segment that we had narrowed down to, that kind of the well-off, relatively well-off folks in the village who are far away from electricity. And typically it'd be, a few households per village that would buy it initially. And then when we brought in product financing, a lot more people could afford it. I think we have a few more pictures here. And yeah, here's the final version. We did some ongoing updates, but that was pretty much the main focus. And so we kept growing the business. I was running the company as CEO. The quick rest of the story is we grew it up to about 100 people. And I was more or less in over my head. I needed some help. So we brought in a new CEO, I came back to the US to start my next company. And the company was sold a few times. Currently, it's kind of being integrated in with some products with a larger consumer electronics company in India. So they're still selling the products 8 years later. Kind of a nice product success story. So that was that one. I have got one. I'll do one more question that was asked, and then we'll move on to the other startup so that we have time for questions and reflections at the end. Question is, could you speak to the tools you use, business model, canvas, et cetera, as you work through the plan and startup process? Sure. For this company, so this was back in 2008. This was actually before the business model canvas was really popular. I'm not even sure it had been invented then. I was using Steve Blank's first book, 4 Steps to the Epiphany, as kind of my guideline through this process. It was the first time I had built a startup. It was extremely helpful. He's since come up with a subsequent book that I found is also great. So I used a lot of his process, but there weren't too many existing tools. We were kind of making it up as we go. And then another question on where are these manufactured? We manufacture in India. We worked with a contract manufacturer in Gandhinagar, just north of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, to make the plastics and do final assembly. And then we worked with a separate electronics contract manufacturer in Bangalore. Okay, so that's the Duron story. I want to switch over to the other story, Jhana, a very different company and very different path to finding our customer segment. Jhana, as I mentioned, was a digital product, so there's not going to be as many pictures. I've got a kind of a step through bullet point for the story, so it's mostly going to be me talking. The genesis for Jhana actually started in Duron, where I was for the first time managing a team of people, and it was way more difficult than I thought it would be. I really struggled a lot with learning how to manage people. And so I was trying to read everything I could. I hired a coach to help me out. And it just wasn't enough. I felt like there was a real need for something better to help new managers. And after I came back to the US, living in India for a few years, I was talking with a lot of my friends who were just starting to be managers too. And they were also facing a lot of the same challenges I was facing or had faced. And so I started looking into ideas for a product that would help new managers kind of learn the basic blocking and tackling of how to be a manager. And that led to Jhana. It was sort of a side project for a while. I linked up with my eventual business partner who's very interested in this as well. And it's kind of slowly consolidated into something we really want to give a try. And so the initial need and market for this was really for ourselves, or I should say for me. I really wanted a product that I could use. So unlike Duron, where we're developing product for somebody else, Jhana, at least in the early stages, was meant to be something that would help me or people like me. And I think there's a lot of pros and cons to developing a product for yourself. You might not be representative of the whole market and kind of miss the opportunity. On the other hand, you know yourself pretty well, so it gives you a nice leg up on doing some of the initial market research. So that's where we started. However, very quickly, we went into a more normal customer discovery process. And we wanted to kind of see if there were other people like me out in the world, try to understand what other new managers are like and what kind of challenges they're facing. So one of the first things we did was go and interview about 30 new managers, mostly through our own network. So they're mostly working at technology companies. I was based in San Francisco at the time. So it's mostly new managers at tech companies in San Francisco. And we learned a ton through those interviews. We were just like at Duron, asking them a lot of questions to understand their context. What do they do all day? What kind of products do they use? What's working, what's not working? Where are their other pain points? What have they considered? What have they tried, et cetera? And that was very helpful in generating some of our early product ideas, particularly in some of the content areas that managers were struggling with. And we decided to kind of do a field trial, but really our field trials, there's a question on were these face-to-face interviews. Yes, almost all of them were face-to-face interviews. And they were typically just similar to Duron, which were also mostly face-to-face interviews. They were typically about an hour to 2 hours long, pretty long interviews. Sometimes we'd split it up into 2 parts. So we'd do an hour and then another hour later. And we'd take extensive notes and write them up and kind of mark up the notes and try to compare from one person to the next and see what comes out of those. So another way of saying is we were really trying to immerse ourselves in what we thought would be our customers' environment and context. So we did these field trials, but a field trial, in this case, we decided to just make a product and try to sell it. And we gave away a few for free also to get some feedback on it. But primarily, it was our early customers of our initial product that were doing our field trials. It wasn't that time consuming to build the first version of the product, unlike at Duron, where we had to set up a full manufacturing unit and spend a lot of money setting on that. We could build something ourselves in a few months that was good enough to sell. And we decided to make, our very first product was a hour-long video course on how to hire somebody. Hiring and recruiting seemed to be a big challenge that was coming up through a lot of our interviews. And we thought videos seemed popular, so let's start with video course. And we were trying to sell that for about $50. I think we sold about 50 of them, which was not nearly as many as we had hoped. It was something. And the feedback we were getting was pretty good, but not outstanding. So we were kind of thinking, well, maybe this isn't quite the right segment or the right product. It wasn't quite feeling like a fit. But we did close our first few B2C sales, selling directly to individuals. And so as we were doing that, we had sold to a number of individuals at some different tech companies. We were approached by some of the HR leaders at those companies. Very big surprise to us. HR was completely off our radar screen. And they said, well, we might be interested in buying this for the employees at our organization, especially if you had some more topics. And so that kind of opened up a whole new customer segment that we hadn't even thought about at all before. And so we went into another exploration, kind of customer discovery phase, trying to learn about HR and heads of HR and heads of learning and development, and whether we thought they'd be a good segment for us. We have a question on how do the HR teams find out about our service? Oh yeah, it was through some of the individuals that were taking it at their company. I think they had chatted with HR. So I have a question on the solar. We might come back to that at the end. So what we saw, we liked. It's very different for us. It's a shift to a B2B model, which we didn't really understand well. But they were offering us a lot more money. They were willing to pay in the thousands of dollars per course or for their whole company, maybe thousands of dollars per year if we had additional content or we kept producing new content. So we decided to pivot in a big way from B2C to B2B, selling into HR, initially with HR leaders at small technology companies, primarily based in San Francisco, because that's where our network was. And we started producing more content. The other big shift on the product side is we realized that video wasn't as strong as we thought it would be. So we shifted to text. That's a longer story and probably beyond the scope of our discussion today. Maybe we'll have time for Q&A on the end if anyone's interested in that. But we did shift the product composition somewhat at this time too. And there were quite a few things we needed to do to get it set up for a B2B sale. Now we're starting to think about user accounts and single sign-on and all those sorts of things that come with B2B. But we went this direction and we got our first few B2B sales very quickly with some of the people we've been talking to. And this kind of felt to us like a much stronger path to market. And so we actually went out and did our first fundraising. Unlike the earlier company, this one, just me and my co-founder were bootstrapping. We were working out of a basement, not taking a salary for the first 9 months. So we had no investor money through everything you've seen so far for Jhana. At this point, we actually did raise a little bit of money, did a friends and family round because we felt confident enough about the business. And we went down this path for quite a while. We were developing more content. We were closing more customers. All of them were, say, small, high growth technology startups, primarily in the Bay Area, typically 20 to maybe 200 people. And at some point, we actually later went through two separate shifts in our customer segment, which are kind of interesting. So I want to play the Jhana story a little bit further forward than the Duron story. Duron was just 3 years. Jhana was about 6 years. And what we found is that after a while of selling to these small companies, we felt like we could probably make more money if we targeted larger companies. So we shifted at some point towards mid-sized technology companies. And these could be as big as 10 or 20,000 employees. In fact, our first really big sale was to Groupon, where we were supporting all the managers at Groupon. And we followed that up with some sales to Uber. We were supporting all the managers at Uber. We were working with quite a few other kind of well-known tech companies. You've probably heard of Eventbrite, et cetera. And they were having a really good experience with the product. And so we basically focused on this new customer segment for the subsequent 3 years. It's kind of mid-market, early adopter tech companies. And then after that, we made another shift, which was to more pragmatic, let's say early majority mid-market technology companies. So we've been working with a lot of the high flyers, young companies that were growing really fast, willing to take a bet on a new product. But we saw an even bigger market opportunity if we could work with the more established companies who had been around for longer, with a very different approach to buying products and different needs. So we went through a whole new customer discovery process yet again to understand this new segment. And then we shifted our product and marketing and everything towards them. And it was a big challenge. Actually, we spent a whole year trying to make this shift. But it paid off. We won a lot of, we were able to support quite a few great customers in this segment, companies like VMware, AOL, Informatica. We've been around for 15 to 30 years, larger organizations, and very different needs and attitudes than our early adopter segment. So that was the yet another new customer segment. And that's the one that we were focused on up through the sale of the company. We sold the company a few years ago to Franklin Covey, who's carried on the product since then. We've got a question here. Do you think your trajectory with the early customer segments was necessary to sell to the ones afterwards? Probably for us, it was. It was sort of an evolutionary path. We always stayed true to trying to make a great product for our users. You know, in the B2B world, our buyers were really the heads of HR, but our users, in the broadest sense, were still new managers. So it was nice that we had developed the initial product for users. It meant that we were often differentiated from our competitors because we had a better product for the users. That was a big selling point for the buyers. And I think it was important too for us to kind of get our feet wet and learn the ropes with more forgiving customer segments, our early adopters, before we got to the more established customers who we really wouldn't have been able to win in our early days, no matter what we did. We just didn't have the content base, the product wasn't there. We didn't really know how to sell it. We didn't have a sales team. Sales and marketing, B2B was very different. So we really needed that early learning. Maybe if you already had experience, or if we already had experience selling into more established customer segments and we had the network, we could have made that work earlier on. But at the time at Jhana, I don't think we could have done it. I do want to share one slide here, which is how we were thinking about B2B customer segmentation. We viewed it along 3 main dimensions, kind of outlined here on this slide. On the top, we had different verticals, and you may be aware there's often many vertical-focused B2B companies, and they'll just develop a solution for technology companies, or maybe they'll even narrow within technology to just aerospace companies, and they'll start there, or they'll just start with finance companies, and maybe they'll expand to more verticals afterwards. Some try to go for all verticals at once, but we really wanted to be focused. The other main, and so we chose technology. We only sold to technology companies for the full 6 years. The other main dimension we looked at was the size of the company. There's the enterprise, which is kind of, you could define it in different ways, maybe 20 to 50,000 employees and up. Mid-market, which is maybe a few thousand to 20,000 employees. Small and medium business, SMB, smaller than that. And then there's individual self-serve kind of models. So we chose mid-market. And then the final dimension, kind of following Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm framework, we simplified a little bit here between the early adopters, kind of the high flyers that I've mentioned, and then the more pragmatic established companies. So we were very laser focused for a while on mid-market technology early adopters. So we've got this big space of possibilities, but we said that's the only group we're going to go to. We said no to any prospects that came in outside of that list, which was very difficult to say no to. We tried a few, but usually we got burned or it didn't work out for some reason. For instance, we tried a few enterprise technology deals that were just too complicated for us, so we kind of retreated back to our mid-market home, and then eventually we made the shift to pragmatists. So that was our way of segmenting the market. We have one question here on, did you have past experience in the field? How difficult was it compared to the first case with Duron? In this case, I think the Duron experience with field research helped a lot. This was much easier with Jhana. We could just meet with someone in a coffee shop or in their office And that was great. In Duron, we would fly around the world and meet with someone in the middle of the summer in rural India. So it was really much easier to do that customer research at Jhana. And we have another question here. How big was the mid-market early adopters in terms of potential sales? What percentage of these customers were you aiming to acquire? Yeah, early adopters usually a pretty limited size in the general scheme of things. It was still plenty big to get us started. I mean, even a few $1 million in business was substantial for us in the early days. So we didn't need a very big market to get started with. And it certainly got us off the ground up into a few million in annual recurring revenue, which was great. And then we could kind of focus on the pragmatists after that. We could prove out the model. We were still aiming to win a fairly small percentage of the customers in that segment. I think we don't know for sure, but let's say there were 300 to 500 customers in that potential customers in that early adopter mid-market technology world. We probably closed about 20 of them, 20 or 25. So we were well under 10%, probably more like 5%. Another question on churn rate. Very low churn rate. Yeah, people love the product. A couple would happen once in a while, but not an issue for us. Okay, so that's the brief story for both of those two startups. I thought what might be interesting is, and I think we've gone through about 35 minutes. So we have about 20 minutes left, 25 minutes left, quite a bit of time. I wanted to make sure there was quite a lot of time so that we could kind of do some exercises together. I thought it might be interesting to start by hearing some of your suggestions, I guess, for the group or observations you made about selecting a customer segment, both from my stories and from your own. So if you want to just throw those into the Q&A, I can just kind of cherry pick some and read them back out loud to the group. We'll go through that. Then I'll share a few of my own. And then we can just open
John, I have a few questions too.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Coming back to the Duron story, and for those who don't know me, my name is Andrew Nui. I work with the MIT Bootcamps team, and we're very pleased to have John here today. Thank you, John. And really, I think my question is going back to your field study. In your field research, from a practical perspective, how did you arrange any meetings, if at all, during your field study? How did you achieve that? Did you have the right connections? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is my first time doing it in a very challenging environment. So it was very difficult. There were two main strategies. One is through connections that we had set up when I was in the US before coming over there. So we would work with a lot of local nonprofits or distributors to kind of set us up with some people to interview. That was, in practice, that it turned out those were often kind of biased on less helpful interviews. A lot of times those organizations had agendas. Sometimes they were just terrifically helpful, and it would work out. But it was always a little awkward. What I found to be more helpful was basically literally renting a car and hiring a translator and hiring a driver and just going in almost a random direction until we found a place, and just stopping, getting out of the car and wandering around until we found some people and just talking with them and started to learn the village a little bit, and they might introduce us to somebody else. So we could spend 4 or 5 hours in a village or town just talking with different folks, and then we get back in the car and go somewhere else. Maybe the driver or the translator would know some places. So it was really shooting in the dark. We had no idea what we would get. But after doing that a few different times, we eventually started to build up a kind of a accurate picture, let's say a fuzzy accurate picture of what was going on. And then when we went back on subsequent visits, we would build on that knowledge. We had more focused places that we would spend more time in. Like my month-long field study, that was just it was a set of small villages in a particular district, Belgaum in northern Karnataka state. So it's pretty constrained. So I got to know that area very well. But that worked well for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how did you pre-select a particular village? I'm assuming that there were many villages in that particular region. What criteria or sort of filters did you have in place already when you were telling the driver, hey, we want to go somewhere. This is, the ideal size of what we're talking about. How did you come up with that?
Well, initially we wanted a spread. We certainly wanted to look at some villages that were off the grid completely, and some that had a little bit of grid electricity, and a few that had good grid electricity, but we really didn't think there was an opportunity there. So we'd often start with unelectrified villages. So do you know a village that doesn't have any electricity? Could ask that question to 5 or 6 people. Eventually someone would know and kind of point us in the right direction. And then the other was on size, town or village, and that kind of correlated, with income level. But that was less important for us in the early days. It was mostly about the unelectrified or poorly electrified. And in some places like Karnataka state, it was a little harder to find completely unelectrified villages. You'd really have to get way off the beaten path. In other states, it was much easier. In certain locations that we were in Kenya, it was again, pretty easy. We had been set up through an organization, and we actually spent, we flew to the other side of Kenya and then went on this dirt road for hours to arrive at this village where we actually stayed overnight, a few nights, just living in an unelectrified village to see what it was like for them. And that was great.
And from a data collection perspective, this will segue into other questions that we have in the Q&A. From a data collection perspective in the field, can you share a little bit more about the tools that you use? Was it just pen and paper or paper and pencil? Did you have any sort of electronic data recording? What was that like?
Yeah, we didn't have anything electronic. I think we must have brought some computers with us, but we weren't carrying those around and taking notes in the field. We would always do these interviews with multiple people. So we would develop a pretty detailed interview guide beforehand with the questions we wanted to ask. But in practice, you'd often go off script. In fact, that was where a lot of the interesting stuff was. When something came up and you're like, oh, that's unusual. I didn't expect that. Tell me more. And you just kind of follow your nose. But we would always have a recorder, someone who is writing down the notes during the interview or discussion, I should say, because there are often multiple people that we were talking to at once. And then right after the fact, whenever we got back to our hotel or wherever we were staying, we try to then type up very detailed notes and extract as much as we could from those. However, in the field, it was mostly pencil and paper. At Jhana, we would do some notes on computers, I should say. Yeah, but still, it was 2 people. Me and my co-founder would do these together, and one person would be asking, the other person would be taking notes.
I'm gonna let you go to the Q&A now, but maybe you can share 1 or 2 significant mistakes that you made along the way as a iteration. Perhaps we can all learn from them.
Well, I have a kind of funny one to start with, maybe, and then could do a couple others. The funny one was on that field trial, the long field trial. So it's sort of our 3rd field trial, depending on how you count. In India, I had hired this was in remote Karnataka. I'd hired a driver, car, and a translator from English to Kannada, the language there. We went to this district. Turns out that district, the people we were working with spoke a different language, Marathi, and I couldn't find a Marathi to English translator. So for the full month field trial, I found a Marathi to Kannada translator. So for a full month field trial, I had to work through 2 translators, English to Kannada to Marathi to the end user. It was a test of patience. So don't do that. Wow. I was just uninformed about the market we were getting into. It was, and I don't know, not so good, but it was kind of fun at the same time. We just laughed about it. Cool. I guess more serious mistakes. I think, let's see, for Jhana, I think it would have been good for us to explore the B2B market a little bit earlier and maybe a little more broadly too. We just had our blinders on B2C. B2B wasn't really in our radar screen at all. And I think in retrospect, I would have given myself the advice to talk with some experts on B2B, just get a little sense of that as an alternative to B2C when you're starting. And maybe we would have decided to start with B2B a little bit earlier. And that could have saved us maybe 4 or 5 months of work, which is a lot of time. I'm glad we did all those interviews. Maybe we could have done more interviews, especially when we switched to B2B. And then for Duron, I think we did a pretty good job, actually. Maybe the one mistake would have been not spending even more time in the field with customers. We were initially based in the US and flying back and forth for the first year before we said, okay, we all need to move to India, which we did. But we were probably spending too much time in the office in Los Angeles. Like, we're not going to learn much in the office in Los Angeles. So I think all of us should have gone early. Maybe we should have just gone to our market for 3 months or 6 months initially and spent a lot more time with our customers and done more of a co-development process with them rather than learning from them and then going back to the engineering lab and building a product and kind of this back and forth thing that we did.
Yeah, and so Peter Pinto is asking, how did you design your interview questions as part of the customer discovery process?
Well, some questions I cribbed from Steve Blank's book. And of course, I was reading a lot of other books as well. I can't remember all the sources, but I try to learn from what other entrepreneurs have learned as much as I can. I knew they should be open-ended questions, where you just talk a little bit and they talk a lot. So you ask something like, how do you light your home today? And just listen to them for a while. And could you show me, what's been working well for you, what hasn't? And we were getting helpful information. I guess it's sort of subjective judgment on what's helpful and what's not. So the initial question list was, just based on us thinking about it, but we refined that pretty quickly. We didn't stress about it too much before we got into the interviews. And then we try out different questions in the interviews and go from there. What we didn't do was have a very structured interview that we would follow with every customer and then do a comparison of this person said this, and like these 20 people answered this one question that we always ask the same way in these 20 different ways. We didn't do that. Maybe that would have been interesting. It hasn't been my style. I've been a bit more freewheeling, using the interview guide as just that, a guide, but then each interview looks pretty different when we get into it. That helps.
Okay. Yes. So, and Consuelo is asking as a follow-up question in terms of the interviews that you had, in interviewing these people, did you also in this process of customer discovery find out other problems that could potentially, that you can keep in your back pocket as a good opportunity to solve, for example, health problems? Did you discover any other stuff as part of this process?
Yes, though we didn't. Once we identified, there are tons of different problems that came up, both with the Jhana interviews and the Duron interviews. You can't help when you're having these discussions to just notice problems that people are having, or opportunities for new products. However, we didn't explore those very deeply because we needed to spend our limited time. I mean, we had spent a lot of money and time to get to these places, especially with Duron. And so we wanted to be very focused on questions and directions that we thought would be helpful for informing our product and company direction. So we kind of note it, but we didn't go there too deeply. Yeah.
Okay, and Don Crispy, I believe, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it right. How many people were involved in this customer / product research for both cases? You said in the field for Duron, you had multiple people. So of course you had the driver, you had the translator, yourself. How many people in your core team were there on site, and what were their roles perhaps? Can you share more about that?
Sure, yeah, we'll do both separate. They're a little different. For Duron, so we had 4.
Yeah, let's do separate, yeah.
Okay, great. There were 3 of us that went on the initial 6-week market research trip to the 4 different countries. And we were all kind of rotating the role of note taker. But basically we would all go together. We didn't split up for that trip very much. Occasionally we would split a meeting, but almost always the 3 of us would go together. So we were all hearing the same thing. And then we'd rotate who would be doing question asker or 2 question askers and who would be taking those. So a typical trip out to somewhere would be the 3 of us plus a vehicle, which is usually a car, sometimes a boat, and a driver and a translator. And that was how we did that. For some of the subsequent field trials, we did split. So the more substantial field trials, there were 2 people that went up to North India, one of whom we had recruited in India and spoke Hindi, so he was able to be the translator for that. And then I did the one in South India. And that one was just me and the driver and 2 translators. And we had our kind of head of engineering, head of product, not at the field trial sites, but he was supporting all the troubleshooting across both sites, kind of remotely. So whenever we had a problem, we'd call him up, or more likely send some emails. So he was kind of a virtual team member for both teams in a way. And then for Jhana, almost all the work was done with my co-founder and me, just the two of us. And we would just split the role of question asker and note taker. That was it. We were both also doing a lot of work to search for the right people to talk to. So we were tapping our networks and doing some cold outbound for that.
And so when you were by yourself, did it significantly take longer because you also had to record notes at the same time?
Slightly. I mean, yes. However, I had plenty of time to do that when the translators were talking.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Actually, no problem.
Oh, okay, because it was like two translators.
Yeah. Even when we had multiple of us with note taking, having a translator, it kind of made it slowed down the pace of the conversation in a really helpful way. Not only because we could take notes, but it gave us plenty of time to really think through what's going on in these conversations, which are operating at many different levels. They're very intellectually engaging. I mean, you're trying to kind of win over these people you haven't met, establish some credibility, make a lot of visual observations about what's going on in the environment. You're trying to keep in mind your segmentation, what questions you want to ask, and then you're trying to interpret their answers, which are often, have a lot of assumptions behind them, and figure out what direction you want to take the conversation next and what you're learning. So there's all these things going on in your mind, and a break with the translator was really helpful before having to ask the next question. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you think it's in person, so it's not just about the conversation, but the non-verbal cues, the gestures, especially because there's a language barrier there. Like, can you share more about what that was like in terms of, observational cues specific to non-verbal communication as well, and how did you kind of get recognize any sort of buy-in or rapport that was continuing to build over time?
Sure. India was difficult for me because I didn't know the culture well. So I'm sure I missed many of the cues that were being sent, nonverbal cues. However, the basic emotions, like, is someone actually really excited? Do they light up and start talking about it like I am now? Or were they just kind of a mundane answer? Not that they say they're excited, but are they really? I don't know. But maybe they're just a quiet person, and they're just not the kind of person that's going to jump up and down about something. So you're kind of second guessing a little bit, but I was certainly trying to take into account those emotional signals that were coming and match them with what they're saying. And so often in the notes, I'd have maybe in brackets or italics or something, I'd kind of try to notate the nonverbal stuff as well. So we'd have that on record when we were doing the analysis later. Kind of same with Jhana. I have done some, and more recently I've done some, like for my current project, I've been doing the same customer discovery process. I've been doing a lot of these over video calls like this one. And that's not quite as good. However, it's faster than traveling somewhere to talk with people. So I think you can still get good information that way. It's even better if you can meet in person.
Absolutely. And fast forward to the end of Duron, when you launched the product, I'm curious to understand, did anybody that you had interviewed end up acquiring one of your products?
Yes. Well, actually, let me qualify that a little bit. Certainly, yes, at Jhana. We had a number of our early interviews were our early B2C customers. And then also when we shifted to B2B, the initial HR folks that approached us, I think at least 2 out of the first 3 turned into customers, our first 2 customers. So that was very clear. Duron was a little different because we were working with a very wide range of different individuals. So for instance, where I did that detailed field trial was up in very remote Karnataka. Why it was so remote is a long story I won't get into. But where we started selling was a little bit different than where we did that initial field trial. So I don't think our initial customers certainly weren't the people we initially interviewed. However, we later then did expand our sales efforts into Belgaum, the district I was in. However, at that point, the company was so big, I couldn't visit all these places myself. We were spread geographically quite wide. So I don't know if some of those initial field trial people actually ended up buying the product. That would be great to find out, but I have no idea.
And so I remember you were saying for Duron specifically, I think you grew up to 100 or 200 people, something like that.
Yeah, about 100, mostly sales and marketing, mostly sales.
And so what was that process like in terms of growing out the team? Was it, you know, door to door? What was that like in terms of getting new customers?
Okay. Okay. So there's two different questions. I think one is how to build the team, and others the sales process.
It was more along the lines of, you know, you had 100 people. I was just trying to understand what those 100 people were for, and you kind of shared sales and marketing. And so the question then was, how did you end up leveraging those 100 people to gain more customers?
Okay. Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So sorry, I missed the question. Was it, what are those 100 people doing?
Yes. How did you leverage those 100 people to gain the next 1,000 customers, or however many customers?
Okay. So it's a very complicated story if we get into details. The quick version is we sold through distributors. So our sales team would look for and appoint a distributor for each district. So Karnataka State has about 25 districts, and Uttar Pradesh has about 60 districts. So we had about 60 distributors, one for each district, or sometimes they'd have multiple districts. The distributors would then have a network of shops and door-to-door salesmen under them that we would kind of co-train. So we had a training team as well that would run these trainings. So our team of 60 salespeople were pretty much setting up and managing the distributors and helping train and support the dealers, the shops, and the door-to-door salesmen underneath them. And then they were selling our products through those channels. We would support with marketing campaigns on the ground through our local marketing agencies that we would hire to run various campaigns. Yeah, so that was the majority of our activity. Early days were all about product and getting manufacturing, and then we very much turned into this sales and marketing machine, much more than a product machine. The balance of people was way higher on the sales side than product side in our later years.
We have just about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes left. John, is there any specific questions you may want to answer if you have a look on the Q&A list? Some last takeaways?
Yeah, maybe I could share a few tips that have, I don't know, this is just a little bit of reflection. Again, I'm not sure what worked for me in either of these companies will necessarily work for you. It's just 2 data points to add to your toolbox of data points. I'll try maybe to pull out a few tips, suggestions here that I'll just run through really quickly at the end. Again, your mileage may vary with these, but something that I found very helpful is talking with a lot of potential customers as early as possible, just getting out of the building, as it's often called. Even if you don't have the best question guide, whatever it is, just go out there and talk about it. You'll learn a ton, or at least I learned a ton when I did it. Especially if you ask open-ended questions. It's always worked well for me. How do you do this certain thing today? You know, et cetera. I think there's an interesting tension between balancing a desire to focus and a desire to explore. I felt that tension a lot through this process at both companies, where you might want to say, okay, we might prefer to just right now focus on this one very narrow customer segment, but we're not that confident. So we also want to explore some other ones. And it'd be possible to probably err too much, be too focused. Like maybe we did at Jhana a little bit. We didn't see the B2B side, or maybe be too exploratory and never really focus, and you never get to the depth you need to really find a good product, find a good pain, find a good product, and bring something to market. And then I guess my last tip or thing that I've noticed is at some point you really just have to give it a try and try building something and selling it, or selling something and then building it and seeing if people buy it. And that's sort of the ultimate validation for a customer segment. So all the work up to that is just saying, okay, we really think someone will probably buy this, but then you've got to go and actually close the sale to prove it. So
that's been such a pleasure, John.
Yeah.
Very insightful.
Sure, thanks. And there was a question on maybe sharing some slides. I think we can probably do that. And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I
If you
think we're
can
probably,
just PDF that and send it off to me, and we'll get that together in the YouTube video recording, and we'll share it shortly afterwards.
yeah, sure. I don't think I got to quite all the questions, so sorry about that if we missed your, if I missed your question, but hopefully got to most of them.
So John, I have a left field question for you. You know, a lot of times they end up reaching out to us and, hey, can I have the presenter's email so we can follow up with them? Is that something that you can do before?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to.
Okay, so if you can put that on your last page of your slide, and we can share that.
Yeah, we'll find a way to share it out. Yeah.
Great. John, thank you very much for your time, for the insightful presentation. It was a pleasure having you. For everybody tuning in today, next month we're going to be launching a intellectual property series with a well-renowned retired partner at a IP law firm in Boston. So stay tuned to that. We'll be sending out an email blast shortly. And again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.